All right, guys, I got Mr. Anderson here, and we're talking about the Cold War. All right, and they call it the Cold War because the two main adversaries, the Soviet Union and the United States, don't directly confront each other in war. And you might, be curious about that. Like if they disagreed on so many things, if they disliked each other so much, why didn't they just fight and get it over with? And the short answer is they couldn't. Why couldn't they go to war with each other, Mr. Anderson?
Because they both had nuclear weapons.
Right.
Kaboom!
Remember I told you guys about Karl von Clausewitz, or maybe you remember talking to me about him. If the war is so destructive that you lose everything fighting it, then you don't fighting it. But don't get it twisted now. There's going to be a lot of shooting in the 5 decades almost that make up the Cold War. Let's take a look at a couple pictures. All right, so this is April of 1945. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, these are Russians. They're Russian soldiers.
Hey, comrade.
There you go. And these are American soldiers.
G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe. They're exchanging food and cigarettes, and they're shaking hands along the Elbe River in Germany. Remember when we were talking about World War II, I told you guys that the Russians were coming from the east and the Americans were coming from the west, and we're all headed to Germany, right? We're closing the vice on Hitler. Well, it's 1945, April 1945, and this is the first time where East meets West, and American and Russian troops sort of meet on the battlefield. And the war is not quite over yet, but in a lot of ways, it's a symbol that they've become, victorious over Hitler. But here's the thing: these guys there on that day, they had a lot in common. So they're both soldiers. They both have the same enemy. They both come from countries that were born out of revolution. But many, many levels higher than them, their leaders definitely don't see eye to eye. And you guys probably recognize this guy right here in the middle. That's FDR. And we've talked about these other two. This guy right here is Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. And this is Winston Churchill of Great Britain.
Okay. I was going to make a prediction. I would say that these guys are going to be friends for a long time.
They're going to be best friends, and it's going to be a buddy comedy.
Great.
I think that they're going to go on misadventures together.
Wacky stuff.
Wacky stuff. Not quite. And so even when this photo was taken, so this would have been, I think, February of 1945, and they are getting together to talk about what's going to happen after World War II.
This is Yalta?
This is Yalta.
Wow.
There's deep distrust. And so FDR here.
He looks almost like an iron curtain between Churchill and Stalin.
Oh, there you go. There is a little bit of an iron curtain that's formed already. Here we go. This is a curtain of iron. Winston Churchill actually came up with that. So Winston Churchill talked about an iron curtain. Winston Churchill, toward the end of World War II, talked endlessly about how the new real threat is Stalin in the Soviet Union. Hitler is defeated.
Man of steel.
Right.
Stalin.
So they're worried about Stalin. FDR, okay.
Nice.
Well, he did. He died in 1945. And Truman, who we talked about, his vice president becomes president, and we had an atomic program. And the Soviets, okay, under Stalin, did not know about it, or so we thought. So we shared our knowledge, our atomic secrets with our British allies, like Churchill here. But we thought we were keeping Stalin in the dark. But really, during World War II, the Soviets had tons of spies in our atomic program. So already, there's this deep distrust, this divide. And it really has to do with what are called ideological differences. Your ideology or like your beliefs. And so Stalin comes from a country that is communist, which is sort of a type of command economy where they ration everything, and where the government sort of controls all aspects of the economy. And that is a very difficult thing for people to come from, like, capitalist economies like ours to grasp. Now, it's not just economics. The Soviet Union was a brutal dictatorship. And I told you guys that Stalin sent millions of people to the Gulag. So there are very big differences between us and the Soviets.
He didn't work out well with the Ukraine either, where they had over 1 million people starved in the 1920s.
That's right.
Ukraine himself. So a lot of blood on his hands.
Absolutely. All right, so here is Germany as it stands at the end of World War II. Hitler, at this point, has taken cyanide and shot himself with his mistress underneath the Reichstag in the Fuhrer bunker in Berlin.
The only positive thing he ever did.
The only good thing Hitler ever did. That's right. And so now the United States and Britain and the Soviets occupy Germany. And so we're going to kind of divide it up amongst us. So the Soviets are going to get kind of Eastern and Central Europe, and then they're going to get Eastern Germany. All right? Germany's going to be divided into East and West. We're going to occupy West Germany with our allies France and Britain. And Germany, in a lot of ways, is going to become sort of the front line of the Cold War. So, like I said, this may not necessarily be a shooting war, but what you're going to see is a lot of competition taking place as the Soviets in East Germany try to rebuild East Germany using the Soviet communist model, while we rebuild West Germany using democratic capitalism. And West Germany is going to take off and very quickly recover, while East Germany, things are not going to go quite as well. And so later on, we'll talk about it, but the Soviets are actually going to have to build a wall, not to keep us out of East Germany, but to keep their people from trying to flee into West Germany.
And that's what they're going to wind up calling the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is going to separate your democratic nations in Europe and your communist nations in Europe.
Churchill said it was as if an Iron Curtain had descended across the world.
He said it in Missouri.
He did. He said he made the speech in Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a piece of the Berlin Wall at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Now that you mention it.
Really?
Yeah, I went and saw it one time.
How about that?
Go ahead, next slide. Okay, so you guys might recognize these two fellows. Although the last time I showed you the gentleman on the left, he had a corncob pipe and aviator sunglasses on.
He didn't have a button nose and two eyes made out of coal?
No, he was probably. Remember, I said MacArthur is very much an egotist, so he's probably like, "Hang on, I got to put on my aviators and put my pipe in. Okay, now go ahead and take the picture." He must not have had him laying around when he took this. So MacArthur is standing beside Hirohito. Remember, he was the Emperor of Japan. Well, now you can see he's in sort of a business suit, and he very much looks more like a kind of a normal leader, kind of a more Western approach. So, after World War II, I told you guys, the Japanese people heard the emperor's voice on the radio for the first time. A lot of them saw the emperor for the first time. And so they're moving Japan away from, its sort of imperial roots and migrating it to a democracy. And Japan's going to end up being one of our strongest allies in East Asia and continues to be today.
MacArthur uses his experience as an American in helping the Japanese actually make their constitution. The Constitution of Japan, to this day, has the fingerprints of General MacArthur all over.
All right. So Europe after World War II is in pretty bad shape, I would say.
They did a good job of wrecking themselves.
Yes, it's in bad shape. So the United States launches something called the Marshall Plan. And this is a plan to pump millions, probably billions of dollars in today's money into all of these European countries to rebuild them. And so you might ask yourself, why? Why are we going to spend all of this money to rebuild all of these European countries? Why do it? If we don't do it, who will?
The communists will.
That's right.
Because when things are bad, people look for an excuse, and they are open to all kinds of ideas. So they come up with the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe so Europe stays democratic and doesn't turn communist. Was it Marshall that really came up with this plan?
I don't think so.
Truman came up with
That's
it.
right.
But why didn't he call it the Truman Plan?
It would have been politicized.
Politicized,
Yeah.
and he was pretty unpopular during the first part of 47.
And George T. Marshall was pretty well respected.
And he was a Virginian.
And
Everyone likes Virginians.
Everybody likes Virginians. So, like Mr. Anderson said, if we don't, the Soviets will. These people are desperate, they're hungry, their homes are destroyed, and if along comes Stalin with his hand out, willing to provide aid, they're going to take it. So we have to help them so the Soviets can't. if you look here on the right, these mules are from Missouri, and thousands of mules were shipped to Greece. Well, the Greek farmers lost all their mules. They couldn't farm. And so here you go. Here comes Uncle Sam with a gift, some nice, sturdy Missouri mules, and now they can till the soil again. Now they can grow crops and support their families and put food on the table. And who are they going to think of when their farms are successful?
Uncle Sam.
And that haberdasher from Missouri, Harry S. Truman. There we go. So the Marshall Plan. This is George C. Marshall, General George C. Marshall. He's kind of an interesting character. One time, he and Truman were about to give an interview in front of the news cameras, and Truman said, "Should I call you George?" And George C. Marshall said, "General Marshall will do." And his driver said that he never stopped for meals. He would just work around the clock and basically live off of coffee and cigarettes.
Coffee and cigarettes.
Not a healthy diet. George C. Marshall, though, heck of a guy. Probably one of the more dramatic episodes of this Marshall Plan was something called the Berlin Airlift. And so remember we said that Germany was divided into East and West, but the capital of Germany, Berlin, which lies in the heart of Soviet East Germany here, was also divided between us and the Soviets. So there was a East Berlin and a West Berlin inside East Germany. Well, the Soviets really didn't like how things were going, and so they said, we're going to cut off Berlin, and basically Berlin will become all Soviet. And so we couldn't let that happen, but there were no land routes into Berlin. So we started something called the Berlin Airlift in 1948 and flew in everything West Berlin. I mean, coal, salt, I mean, you name it, candy bars, you name it, we flew it in there. And as one plane was landing, another one was taking off, and this was a very closely, carefully coordinated operation. And it's really just one of those sort of humanitarian moments in history you can't forget about. They said the pilots would fly over and around Christmas time, and they would attach little small parachutes to toys and throw them out to the German children. You got to keep in mind, this is 1948. This is just a few years after World War II. So some of these pilots had flown over German cities just a few years before dropping bombs, and now they're dropping teddy bears, and it shocked the Soviets. They couldn't believe that we would go to such great lengths to keep this once sworn enemy alive. And eventually they lift the blockade, and the United States and its allies are triumphant. So we talked about some of the failures of World War I, and you guys might remember what that world government was called. What is it again, Mr. Anderson?
League of Nations.
The League of Nations. And what would you say the biggest issue with the League of Nations was after World War I?
No one was forced to supply troops. You supplied troops at your own will. If you wanted to, you could. If you didn't, you didn't have to. And the United States never backed it.
The United States never backed it. We didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Remember I showed you guys the political cartoon? The Keystone and the League of Nations bridge, the United States Keystone was missing. So once Hitler was on the rise in the 30s, the League of Nations was not going to be able to stand up against German rearmament. Well, following World War II, we're going to create the United Nations. And this is a world government. Its purpose is, among other things, to prevent future wars. And you can see a little bit how it's organized here. So the United States, along with China, France, Britain, you have 5 permanent members and then 10 non-permanent members who are elected on 2-year terms. These are the really big decision makers. You have the General Assembly here, and you guys don't have to necessarily know all this. You'll probably learn about it in government class next year. But it's good to understand how this works. So the General Assembly are 193 other countries that can issue what are called non-binding resolutions. Look over here on the left. All of these are organizations like the World Health Organization is really important right now. It's 2020. The coronavirus is spreading. The World Health Organization, very active in combating that. You have UNESCO that helps protect World Heritage sites, like very important historical sites around the world. the UN High Commission on Refugees that helps refugees. So the UN doesn't just prevent wars, it feeds people, it loans people money, and generally or it tries to combat pollution, plastic in the ocean, all sorts of different things. So it generally just tries to make the world a better place. All right, guys. Well, it looks like that is it for 13A, and we'll see you guys next time, where we'll kind of get into the origins of the Cold War a little much, and a little more, and maybe talk some more about the differences between the Soviets and Eastern satellite countries, the Warsaw Pact versus the United States and its Western allies, NATO. Okay.